In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Please be seated. Good morning. Run out of bulletins. What is up with that? Tell you what, heads are going to spin. I like talking tough every now and then. Of course, I'll cower between now and tomorrow morning. We're glad you're all here today. I understand we did have enough bulletins. Is that right? We did find some bulletins, I hope. Anyway, I'll try to stay in the gospel. Today I'm going to preach on the gospel, and so I'll read different parts of it to make sure that you have an opportunity to be in the story with us. We are continuing on our way to Jerusalem. Jesus has made that turn toward the city of Jerusalem, and he is making his way, it would seem, that way, but he's still in the north. It looks like he's still in the northern, up in the northern country, still in Galilee. The reason we know that is because the folks who've come from Jerusalem to warn him about Herod are warning him to flee before Herod catches up with him. And Herod, he basically rules the north. That's where he is. And so the suggestion here is that he needs to move a little quicker, getting down south toward the city of Jerusalem and to a different place. What's fascinating about this is trying to understand what the Pharisees were really thinking. What did the writer mean here? It's hard to find another place in the gospel, in the Gospels, where the Pharisees try to help Jesus. I mean, this is strange. And so, and if you read different commentaries, scholars will approach it from different angles. Some will suggest that maybe this was a part of that Pharisaic group, that this was a faction within that group that was somewhat more pro-Jesus. Maybe like Nicodemus. Remember the Nicodemus story? Remember Joseph of Arimathea, who came after he dies and wants his body to put it in a freshly hewn tomb, a tomb that's hewn out of the rock, freshly hewn out of the rock. And these were people who were part of that Pharisaic group, and yet they tended not to be so adversarial toward him. They saw him, as Nicodemus said, they saw him as being from God. Maybe these are friendly Pharisees. Or maybe these are Pharisees who are just trying to press him to move faster toward the city of Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is the city that kills the prophets. It's hard to know, really. But as soon as Jesus is warned by this group, by the way, the other thing it points out to me is, it reminds me of how messy it was in that first century. Our politics are messy today, right? It wasn't any different in the first century. In fact, it was probably messier in the first century. The Jewish Congress, the Jewish Sanhedrin, was made up of Pharisees and Sadducees and Herodians and probably other groups and factions within those groups. And so it wasn't different. Nothing ever changes. Nothing ever changes. And let me tell you, there's a part of this story where that's good news. Because the good news in this story is that God doesn't change in God's attempt to try to gather his children. And that's the good news in the story this morning. Before we get there, though, Jesus turns to these Pharisees and he says something like, I don't care about Herod, that old fox, that old sly booger, and that people were very much aware of. Herod was seen as something of he was someone that sold out his people. He was working for the Romans. He was a puppet king, and he had all of his power and authority through the Romans. And so he was not looked upon favorably. He could be certainly was notoriously immoral. And Jesus was aware of that. So I'm sure Jesus did hold contempt for Herod. But when he says here, tell that fox for me, I really think, here's what I think's going on. I really believe that this is an expression of Jesus' courage. I think he's reached a place in his moving toward Jerusalem and what it will hold for him and his appointment with the cross. I think he is so sort of grabbed hold of that and what it will mean for his life, and ultimately that's his course, that's his purpose. He has to stay the course. That to me, when he says, go tell that fox for me, what I hear is courage. It's, I don't care anymore. I don't care what Herod can do to me. I don't care what the Pharisees or the Sadducees or any other sees. I don't care. I am committed to the course that I'm on. I'm called to a purpose. And then he goes on to describe what that's going to look like. Look at what he says as you move through the gospel. He then says, I've got to stay the course to Jerusalem. And then he says, oh yeah, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. Quickly it moves to a lament. He begins to lament. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets. The city that kills the prophets. Suddenly he's right back in touch with all of salvation history, all of God's attempts to get to his children through the prophetic line and tradition, trying desperately to gather his people, his children. Much like he uses this wonderful image this morning, a feminine image for God, and this hen, much like a hen tries to gather her brood under her wings. It's very intimate. No, I don't know if you've ever watched a hen. You don't mess with her brood. She's willing to die. She's willing to die for her brood. Jesus says, I'm going to Jerusalem, Herod, Pharisees, Sadducees, whoever would try to stop me. I'm going to the city that kills the prophets. And I think I know what's going to happen there. But I'm going to take one last shot at communicating what God's been trying to say all along. God has tried over and over and over again to gather his children under those wings of amazing grace, extraordinary love and mercy. And they have not been willing to listen. And so today we hear Jesus say again that I'm going to go and speak that truth to God's people, and I'm going to hope that they're going to respond to this invitation to come together under those wings of grace. There was, how many of you saw the Super Bowl commercial about, the commercial was done by Android, right? Android is a, now watch me forget what they do. The Android is a large company. This, by the way, I thought was genius. I thought, I'm going to go hire this person. Because this new sort of brand and the language that they've grabbed hold of to sell their product, I think is just genius. And it so relates to what we've been trying to do here and communicate here at Christ Church over the past 10 or 12 years. But Android is this operating system that provides power. It provides power to billions of gadgets and all kinds of stuff all over the world, all over the globe. Cars and watches and computers and anything you can imagine, Android does. And so they came up with these commercials. One they showed at the Super Bowl where he had the animals, where the animals were not animals that you would expect to hang together. And they were, and the line is, after you see these animals that are very different, hanging together, it says, be together, period. Not the same, period. Wow. I mean, I stayed in that for like the week or so after the Super Bowl, and then all of a sudden, their local commercials began to run. Now, this one you've seen locally. The local commercial is, and I saw it because I saw it again, it grabbed my attention, there's a guy playing a piano, and there are all these keys together on the piano keyboard, and they're all different, and the music is beautiful. And then he turns to this other piano, and he's over here, and all the keys are together, and he begins to play them, but they're all the same, and it sounds terrible. Be together, period. Not the same. So I was right back in that place this week as I was pondering this text and trying to understand what God's communicating to us here. And then I kept hearing Jesus say, I'm going to Jerusalem, that place that kills the prophets. And I kept thinking of that prophetic tradition, that prophetic line that has continued to try to speak God's truth to the world and challenge the world in different times and places. And I was right back with Dr. King. This is Black History Month, and you all know I enjoy reading Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s writings, and I love talking about his vision, his dream because I was right back in his dream this week. And what I kept seeing was, as it related to this text, as Jesus is trying to gather, as God's always trying to gather, I kept hearing Dr. King share a vision, a dream. And I realized it wasn't his, it wasn't new. It was an old vision, an old dream. And he saw black and white people together. Not the same. Not the same. He saw them together standing against the evil of those who would press for sameness. He found the courage to go to Jerusalem, to Memphis. He knew he was going to die. He told his friends, "I will die very soon." He went to Memphis, where the prophets were killed, and he preached togetherness. And those who would press for sameness, the face of evil, would kill him. And then I was in Germany. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, of course, the great Lutheran pastor and theologian who's given us that great classic, The Cost of Discipleship. Just one of the great Christians of the 20th century. I was right back in Nazi Germany when Bonhoeffer was going back to Germany, and his friends all warned him, "You can't go back to Germany. He's going to get you." Because Bonhoeffer was one of those that was willing to stand up against those who would preach sameness. What an ugly, diabolical evil Hitler tried to press on the world as he tried to create this perfect race, a perfect religion around this notion of sameness. And Bonhoeffer would challenge Christians and Jews to join hands and find a way to quiet the darkest, the dark one. Bonhoeffer Flossenburg is where he was hung, the Nazi concentration camp at Flossenburg. He did die. Jerusalem always kills its prophets, especially those who challenge us not to live our lives so much. And this is what I had to get in touch with in my own life in the past week, was really struggling with how I too am caught up in this notion that, or how I too maybe even press for sameness because I'm more comfortable in sameness maybe. Or why am I so fear? I was in touch with my own fear about really being open and hearing the call in my life to really gather God's people together, not in a way that is like-minded or same, but in all of God's children, all of their diversity and the wonder of that diversity, to find the courage to speak like Dr. King, to speak like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, to speak like Jesus and others who would challenge us to see a new vision of the world, to hear a dream, to envision a dream for the world that's different. It's so much easier to just choose sameness. It's so much easier, isn't it, just to go along with your crowd. Maybe we find the courage this week to become prophetic. Maybe you and I find the courage this week to become different for the sake of community, for the sake of togetherness, as a way of somehow helping all of us tap more into our potential as people of faith. People of faith. Maybe we learn to communicate the gospel in a way that's not so much about striking people who are different from us, but communicating the gospel in a way that invites people to come close to a life and a force, a love that has the power to change their lives. It's been preached for thousands of years, really. It wasn't born in Jesus. It was just Jesus was God's last shot at trying to get our attention. Not his last shot, but it was the last good shot that God decided to take God's self. Let's find the courage this week to be different, to be prophetic. Don't just fall in line for the sake of sameness. It oftentimes leads to destruction and evil, even evil. practice togetherness, build community in your homes, in your offices, where you work, where you play, here at church. Look for ways to build community, to be constructive in the face of destruction in our world today. So much that is full of evil intent. May we be people of the light, people of love, people of hope. It takes courage. Amen.